Francis of the Filth, Chapter 7. In a hole in the ground there lived a Negi, and a rather nasty, dirty, wet hole it was too, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, unlike those dry, warm, sandy holes with divans to sit on and smorgasbords to eat from. It was a Negi hole, and that primarily means misery. Negus were roots who tended not to have names as such, but rather went by groupings and numbers. This particular Negi's identification was Negi Generation 1. The 1 suggests that he was the first in his particular grouping, the generations as this group were known. He was directly related to Negi Generation 4, who was his nephew in fact, who had earlier come to a grisly demise in a foreign land. All of the generation Negus had come to know of it, and most of the other Negi groupings knew of it too. Much was said of his wandering off like that to distant realms and dimensions, so poorly prepared and ill-equipped, and of the Dark Lord who had not only dismembered him, but, it was widely believed, also orchestrated the whole sorry affair from beginning to end. Negi Generation 1 rose from his soggy hole one dim morning and made his way, for reasons which entirely eluded him, to the top of a nearby hill. There he fossicked and picked about, wondering what to eat for breakfast. There was a purpose in the air that morning, a calling as it were, yet he could not put his finger on it in any precise sort of way. He just knew he needed to be on the top of that hill looking out over the fields below. Though their worlds were soon to come together, at this point in our story, Frank and his friends remained in New York City, sleeping heavily after a night of merriment. It was Safari Man who brought the dawn.
Psst.
Frank turned in his bed with a head pain that was so bad he felt as though he had been stuck with an anvil.
Psst.
Safari Man said again.
What?
He croaked.
We have to go now.
Frank wasn't used to Safari Man whispering. It gave a freaky alternate universe feel to his waking.
Why, and what's that awful smell?
Probably your breath, Franku, but no time for that now. We have to go. We have the chromosomes, and I suspect Chin Chin knows that you have them.
Why would you suspect that?
It's the air, the smell in the air. There's a tinge of sulfur in the air, and that often means that he is on his way. We can't waste any time. We must go now.
Frank roused Pink Guy, Salamander Man, Alpha Centurion, and Drone, and the 6 of them, still scratching their heads and backs and pimply buttocks, silently filed out of the apartment and down onto the street. None of them, save for Safari Man, had bathed for epochs. Pink Guy groaned at Frank.
We don't want to make a mess of the apartment, Pink Guy. You know how messy these transports can be. We might need the apartment to come back to at a later time.
He turned to Safari Man.
Where to?
Safari Man ran off toward the subway. They were a sight early in the morning. A Japanese man wearing a safari hat and a Hawaiian shirt muttering ha ha ha, followed by a German-Japanese man wearing a badly stained blue shirt, sunglasses, and a World War II flying cap, followed by a pink guy holding a ukulele and running with a hobble, followed by a green salamander-looking entity twisting his nipples as he ran, followed by a drone in flight, followed by a shirtless runt speaking purely in cuss words as his friends moved further and further ahead of him down the street. Even in the early hours of the morning, the city was bustling. There were no public places that maintained any sense of privacy. Safari Man looked about him, increasingly frustrated and anxious.
We have to go.
He kept muttering.
We have to go. He could be here any moment.
The others followed closely behind him and shared his growing nervousness.
Underground. We have to go underground.
Plenty of people in the subway already.
Not the subway. Underground here.
He said, moving to the edge of a side street right outside a Planned Parenthood center.
This manhole. This will take us underground. I have the coordinates. We'll make the move down there.
The only problem was none of them could remove the cover.
We need something to stick into the openings to use as a leverage,
Frank instructed. They looked about but saw nothing that could be used. Spurred on by Safari Man's nervous whining, Frank turned to Salamander Man.
Your recorder, my friend. We can use your recorder to lift the lid off the manhole.
Salamander adamantly shook his head.
Yes.
He insisted.
Yes.
He said again, assuring Frank that the cover would only break his recorder and then they would have neither the protection of being underground nor the comfort of his music.
It's a risk we have to take, Salamander Man. Chin Chin could be here at any moment, please.
With the forlornness of one handing over a child, he placed his recorder in Frank's hands. And with that instrument alone, they succeeded in lifting the cover off the manhole, and with many hands helping, were able to return the recorder more or less intact to Salamander Man's possession. The beauty of that moment was not lost on any of them. They paused to reflect on it, before suddenly jumping down the hole. Safari Man led the way. He was followed by Alpha Centurion, then Salamander Man and Drone, Pink Guy, and finally Frank. Yet just as Pink Guy climbed in, a passing patrol car pulled over with the customary screech of tires and squeal of a siren. A fat white officer jumped out and ran over to the opening just as Frank was disappearing down it.
What the hell is going on down there?
He bellowed. His pistol was drawn. Frank, now loaded with chromosomes, just managed to pull the cover back in place before jumping to the bottom of the hole. He could hear more officers gathering around and calling for backup to come and remove the cover. It was with great disappointment that each of them realized one by one that they had not entered an electrical manhole, nor a manhole for telephone lines or gasworks. They had entered a sewer tunnel, and though the cracks in the pipes were small, the stench they released was intolerable, and as they moved along the tunnel, the pipes crumbled away to nothing, and they found themselves wading through fetid, ankle-deep waters of urine and feces. Each of them were caused to vomit at least once. It became clear that the risk of disease from this hole in the ground was greater than any risk they might face from a bullet.
Now, Franku,
Safari Man said,
You got the coordinates?
I think so.
I hate it when people say I think so. We're not going on a holiday, you know. I don't want to end up in some hellhole on the other side of the Omniverse.
I have the coordinates.
he said, but his voice was wholly unconvincing. They huddled together, all 6 of them. Despite the squalid environment, Alpha Centurion had never known such affection and found the intimacy very comforting. "This is nice," he said. The others looked at him with tremendous concern. Then, ignoring him, Frank removed a small piece of broken glass that he kept in his pocket, made a gash at the base of his left palm, and moved around his 5 tightly gripped friends, sprinkling a circle of blood into the foul waters now at their knees. Safari Man began to recite the coordinates. Frank continued circling his friends and dripping the life source around them.
Sulfur?
Frank asked.
You smell sulfur? Over this stench, you're able to smell sulfur?
Yes, that is definitely sulfur.
Said Safari Man.
When you eat as much ass as me, you learn to smell what you want to smell.
Then a tear dropped from his eye.
If you ever need to talk, Safari Man, I'm here.
Thanks, my dad can be a real dick sometimes.
Safari Man began to call out the coordinates with greater speed and fervor. "I smell it too, Frank," shouted Alpha Centurion. "It's overpowering the reek of the sewer. Chin Chin must be close." He began to wail as he said this. Frank circled a little more quickly, and Safari Man began to call the coordinates with a fresh desperation. Even Frank now, as he worked his way around and around the group, could distinctly detect the sulfurous odor. Pink Guy and Salamander Man began to shout and scream. Alpha Centurion muzzled hard into Pink Guy's thighs.
Come on, Safari Man.
Yelled Frank. The sulfur was so pungent now there was no longer any scent of bodily waste. Safari Man started calling the coordinates so zealously it became unclear what language he was speaking. At that moment, 3 things happened simultaneously. The ground dropped beneath them, a flashlight shone from one direction, and a small orange flame appeared at some distance in the other direction, licking and flicking in an ominous manner. The ground they were standing on dropped again. The 5 friends found themselves standing up to their necks in the thick, malodorous soup, except for Alpha Centurion, who was clinging to Salamander Man, and Drone, who was hovering above. They stuck together tightly. The flashlight slowly drew nearer. "NYPD," came the call. From the other side, the orange flame took form, silently morphing from the outline of one creature into another. The ground dropped again and 6 of them were underwater. Though they became frantic in their inability to breathe, they remained tightly held to each other. They kicked and bucked in the filthy solution, desperate for air and repulsed to their core as the torrent of effluent flushed about them. It was Alpha Centurion who gave in first. He inhaled and took a full measure of the soiled waters into his lungs. There was a moment of tremendous shock, and then the life was gone from him. This experience was then quickly shared by Salamander Man. Pink Eye held on for longer, but it was no benefit. He opened his mouth and the brown river flowed in. He convulsed for a few short seconds before falling lifeless and taking Drone with him. Frank looked over at Safari Man, who was smiling back with 2 thumbs up. He was swishing the stuff around in his mouth and gargling and giggling.
When you've eaten as much ass as I have, you learn to taste what you want to taste. Right now, I can imagine tasting cheap soil.
How is that any better?
Asked Frank. A tremendous explosion then collapsed the tunnel and punched a hole right through the road above. It shattered the Planned Parenthood Center and left glass and debris all over the remains of the street,
Yeah,
said Frank as everything began falling in upon him.
Planned Parenthood. Seems like a nice place.
2 policemen were caught in the explosion, one killed and the other critically wounded. The wounded policeman, a black man, fell in on top of Frank. Frank, seeing he had a hand in his pocket, began to beat him furiously. Other police on the scene began to deal with the fallout, help the injured, and cordon off the area. The officer who had seen Frank enter the manhole provided his description to a sketch artist, and soon, Kamikaze Frank's mug appeared on all news bulletins as one wanted in connection to a terrorist attack. Frank looked up through the fetid waters and wreckage to see a huge, menacing orange flame hover above him. He gave a mighty gasp and felt the pulpy waste food into his mouth, swirl around his teeth and tongue and fill his lungs. He vomited, but it was returned, washed straight back into him with the tide of filth. His last recollection was of a flaming hand reaching down through the waters toward him, but not before the dark covers closed above him. Negi Generation 1 stood on the peak of a large hill, moist from heavy rainfall and lush with green foliage. He peered out over the landscape. Aside from the greenery which dotted the countryside in hilly clumps, it was a decidedly gray and brown outlook, the sort that would immediately make one want to go back to bed and curl up for the day under the blankets if indeed one were fortunate enough to have a bed and some blankets. Negi Generation 1 didn't, so he remained on the top of the hill pondering what mysterious force had led him up there. Before the overcast sky had lightened, he noticed the muddy ground under his feet becoming more sodden and slippery, as though affected by a great deluge. Only there was no deluge. There was nothing in the air but a cool and gentle breeze. Underneath him, though, in a circle above 5 meters from side to side, the ground continued to soften and liquefy. He tried to step out from it, but only slipped before sinking into it. Panic set in as he was swallowed deep into the mire. He grasped for his life, digging and clawing at the softening clay, but to no avail. There, more he struggled, the more he was sucked further down, until his feet found support in a mesh of branches and sprigs beneath him. These stoked his relief in keeping him from sinking further, and his curiosity, for he could feel the branches moving, wriggling, and twisting. They were rising up from under him, and as they rose, so did he. The boughs he began to make out were colored, pink and blue and red and green and white and brown, and they soon found voice, initially with the moans of a tree bending under the force of a hurricane, then with the screams of one in utter torment, but eventually in utterances that distinctly resembled intelligent language.
Get the fuck off me!
Get your foot out of my mouth.
I hate you, you clut.
You are disgusting!
No, you are disgusting.
I can still feel it between my teeth.
This was followed by incessant spitting, deep and prolonged burping, and the off vomit. Rather suddenly, the blue one turned to Negi Generation 1, who was still lying in mud with his legs over the chest of a froggy-looking character, and said,
Who the hell are you?
Iha amhi Negi hu generation hi one ho.
The little white and brown-topped creature repeated his introduction. He stood before Frank with a rather cute and harmless demeanor, a slight lean in his posture, and an apparent readiness to bow at any moment before his visitors.
I think I understood that.
Frank said, more to himself than to anyone else.
You're Negi Generation 1.
Yesha.
He said with a cautious grin.
Any relation to Negi Generation 4?
The old Negi's face dropped.
Yesha.
He was a good Negi,
Said Frank.
I miss the little fella.
Indeed hu hehe was ho gura hehi hadhu ahibado speecha impedimenti tohu. Marehim ho very ha hardly tohu understand he.
You're not kidding.
But ho he hawashi al hu hearth. Aho true ha negerhi. Yuhu must be ho franca.
How did you know?
You he have who become he known ho across he the he omniverse shu frankie. The ho power sha are he shifting who and he there ho ishamuchi talk who concerning he you ho.
Frank's friends were still writhing, screaming mess on the ground, clawing at and striking one and calling each other all manner of names and verbs.
What's wrong he with who them he?
It hasn't been an easy passage.
Indeed it hadn't. Death by feces turned out to be the least of their issues. Safari Man's coordinates had taken them to another realm, a dark, hellish corner of the Omniverse haunted by fallen mere mortals, those of the very worst ilk who had betrayed their kind and brought unspeakable misery to others. Below that of lawyers and dictators and even internet spammers, this inferno was kept especially for the most vile and depraved of all humankind. Dark, cringy, and plaguey, this hell had been reserved exclusively for atheists, feminists, and vegans, and was infinitely worse than even Hitler's bastion of hell, which appeared like an uppity girl's juvenile detention center by comparison. The torment experienced by Frank and his companions in that place brought personality-changing trauma, and they were furious with Safari Man for making such an appalling blunder. Trapped there, their only means of escape turned out to be through a series of murky underground streams which brought them up to where they now lay. Though released from its infernal clutches, the virulence of that place remained within them, eating away at their souls and their solidarity. It was Negi Generation 1 who restored their fellowship by assuring them that Safari Man had made no such mistake. The Maximum Ha Infernohi. as he referred to it, was well known and feared by those in Negiland. For reasons that none of them knew, both the hell they passed through and the land they had now arrived in had shared coordinates despite being completely separate realms. Possibly, the interconnecting streams were to blame yet, Negi Generation 1 explained. There was never any interaction between the two realms, as the Negis were always too afraid of the Maximumha Infernohi, and the inhabitants there were either unaware of or disinterested in any entity belonging to this particular realm. Upon hearing this, the other members of the band removed their fists and feet and blades from Safari Man's face and ribcage and testicles, and the whole lot of them stood, a bit sore and sorry, before Frank and Negi Generation 1.
Weha masti behu careful he.
Their new Negi friend told them.
Deho darka lordi chin chin hu hashi sento alta ahi message hu that the aho hai ha chromosome hi man hu ishi running ho around her with the hishu pase he. That's ho you ha Frankie. And who ehi larga ho bounty ha hashi bean hu puti on ho yura head.
How much?
Safari Man asked, his interest piqued.
How could you even think of asking that?
Pink Guy put to him. He was fully eloquent in this realm.
Nice to have you back, Pink Guy. What happened to you in New York?
I can't say, but it was awful. Like being a fully functioning person trapped in a wholly retarded shell. Very frustrating.
Behu masti beho quieta.
Negi 1 cautioned.
Looky down o there he.
Drone took flight to observe. Below them, spread across the landscape as far as their eyes could see, was a field of Negus, impossibly large and surprisingly uniform, with their white necks and brown heads protruding from the ground and lolling about as the gentle breezes blew across them. They were all asleep, as though in a trance, yet warned, Negi Generation 1, if awoken they would turn vicious, and without any hesitation rise and attack. The Negus spread out before them were not of the Generation clan. The Generations, who made their home in the moist hillsides to the south, were rank-and-file friendly, and indebted to Frank for his tutelage of Negi Generation 4, despite his unfortunate demise. The other Negus clans, primarily of the plains, had no such allegiances, and with an unparalleled fear of Chin Chin and a handsome bounty dangled in front of them, would think nothing of lopping off the heads of these harvesters. Negi Generation 1 gestured for silence before leading them single file along a low mountain ridge, which rimmed the field of Negis. Their mood was somber. They carried the trauma of the recent transport, and one got the feeling that Safari Man, though excused for any misdirection, had not been wholly forgiven by all in the party. The stench of the sewer, the desiccation of their skin, and the flecks of the excrement still between their teeth kept them irritable. Furthermore, they were hungry. They traipsed along, occasionally tripping on roots rising above the ground or the uneven surface of the terrain, sometimes giving each other a less than friendly poke or shove for good measure. Negi Generation 1 picked up on their tetchiness and led them deep into the vegetation on the hilltop. There, he pushed them all under the cover of a thick fern-like plant, where they were to hide in silence until he returned. They watched him through the fronds of the plant, this demure little fellow gingerly making his way a short distance through the greenery before stopping at the base of a tall, branchless tree. Then in a most practiced manner, he hopped onto the trunk and began to climb up to the top, where he waited without a hint of motion. Time passed, but in this land also, it was virtually impossible to determine what period of time might have been. Pink Guy, however, did notice that the clouds above them had almost moved from one side of the horizon to the other before Negi Generation made his move. It happened following a soft rustle which came from a shrub just under Negi 1's tree. A second quiver saw a Susquian, a reptilian bird slightly larger than a wild turkey, come strutting out into the open, and this set Negi Generation 1 into action. One moment, he was a languid little vegetable clinging to the top of a tree. The next, he was a demoniac in flight. He dropped from his position and landed right on top of the creature. It never had a chance. Negi was a whirlwind of razor-sharp teeth, claws, and cacodemonic screaming. The posse sat still hidden, with their eyes and mouths wide open in shock, each thinking exactly the same thing. If one Negi was capable of such savagery, what would become of them? If a whole field of Negis were activated against them? The job done. Negi bundled up his catch and dragged it over to where his new friends were waiting. He stood before them, now calm, genteel, and seemingly half the size he was a moment ago, and, with a hint of glee, said,
Lunch out.
He dug a pit in the ground, threw the bird in, along with some coal, which was plentiful in that region, lit it, covered it with leaves, and in no time, they were eating the most delicious barbecued meat they'd had in a long, long time. Negi said,
This is a rare delicacy in my land. However, it's not as good as faggot.
What?
said Frank, spitting out his food.
Faggot?
Is that a speech impediment thing?
What do you mean speech impediment? You've never seen a nice juicy faggot before?
Frank refused to comment any further. He was keen to take a little nap following the meal, something the others were happy to join him in, but Negi Generation 1 assured them that they had to move on and away from the massive Negus littering the landscape below. They followed him back to the ridge, again in single file and in much better spirits with fuller stomachs and friendlier words, where they proceeded to march in careful silence with the lush vegetation to their left and the enormous expanse of Negus below them to their right. They hadn't gone far when Pink Guy let go with a fart that was so loud it sounded like he was starting up a chainsaw. It reverberated across the fields below, as though played through a bullhorn. The 7 of them stood motionless on that ridge, in a frozen fear, and watched as hundreds of thousands of Negis below slowly awakened and came to life. It was a serene scene at first, as the Negis stretched and turned in their burrows, bending backwards and forwards in a gentle, rhythmic fashion. In no time at all, though, they turned decidedly hostile. Their faces, just moments earlier, calm and sleepy, became agitated and gnashed with a ferocity they had rarely seen. The Negus ripped themselves out of their beds, turned and faced the characters on the hill with a spine-chilling war cry, rushed as one towards them with nothing but leeks in their hands and death and destruction in their Negimines. It was the sheer sound of the coming onslaught that instilled a deep fear in Frank and his friends. A hideous, high-pitched scream, it filled the skies and penetrated their bones, sending them running in all directions. As their enemies drew nearer, the posse could see in more detail than they cared for the very face of Feral. With shards of glass for teeth and icicles for eyes, the Negis advanced at a rapid pace, wielding leeks like madmen and tossing their heads about like laundry in a typhoon. The friends flustering about was the very antithesis of any sort of organized response, and only spurred the Negis on to the greater violence. Yet it soon brought out the primal savage in each of them, except for Safari Man, who soiled himself. Frank scared himself with a newfound aggression and began to punch and kick while producing sounds from his mouth that he had previously only heard from animals in agony. Utilizing a good-sized branch he found lying nearby, he discovered it worked superbly as a mace, and with it he beat the Negus black and brown. Wielding it, he found he could wipe out scores of the veggies in a single sweep. He found a new thrill in hearing their war cries turn to scream, or better still, their bodies rip in half as he clubbed right through them. He picked a Negi up and snapped his neck before letting out a hideous cackle. It aroused in him an aggression that had been lying dormant for many years. Provocations of the Indonesian military and Sergeant Benson flashed across his mind. He poured out his vengeance, a wrath he never knew he harbored, on the hapless Negis, and they paid dearly for their assault. Finding skills within him he had previously known, Pink Guy, too, came alive. Drawing on the breakdancing he picked up in New York, he proceeded to spin and kick and thrust and chop, all to the accompaniment of haunting kung fu howls. Despite the brutality of the battle and the enormous loss of Negi life around him, there was a poetry to the way Pink Guy fought, and there were moments when he almost succumbed to the attacks of the Negis because he was so absorbed in the beauty of his own movements. Furthermore, he found his ukulele to be a most effective weapon, not only in the way it could knock the whole face of a Negi, but in the beautiful sounds the strings made when it did so. Alpha Centurion was in his element. Not only could he put his finely tuned miniature physique to work, but he could also finally give his unsavory vocabulary a solid workout in an appropriate context. With his natural height restriction, he was perfectly placed to strike long and hard directly into the testicles of the Negus. This turned out to be a particularly sensitive spot for them, and many began to withdraw from the runt when they saw how much agony and damage he was capable of inflicting in such a short space of time. Taking his position in the air where the Negus had neither height nor the brains to reach him, Drone was king. He was able to wreak losses upon the Negus on a far greater scale than any of the others, and with little threat to his own safety. Occasionally one of the Negis would try to throw a leak at him. As ferocious as they were hopeless shots, and Drone was never in danger. He soon found himself actually enjoying the battle. Salamander Man's tactics were wholly different. A musician at heart, not a fighter, he began to play a soothing lullaby on his recorder. Frank very nearly clubbed him with his mace for this until he saw the effect it had on the Negi. All within hearing range would stop running, drop their leeks, and become completely docile, swaying gently before falling to their knees and drooling. What followed was the physical result of a spiritual phenomena. The souls of the Negis began to leave them. They rose up a translucent version of their physical frame into the air before disappearing altogether. Demons then attacked the Negi souls and violently raped them mid-air. They begged for help as every one of their orifices was filled with demonic genitalia. What remained on the ground were soulless shells of what once were Negis. They remained motionless husks. Salamander Man leisurely walked through the throngs of Negi, playing his tune, leaving a trail of gentle destruction in his wake. The big disappointment amongst the posse was Safari Man, who turned, ran, and hid in a small cave, rolling a large stone up to its mouth. He waited out the battle in a cool darkness. Never having engaged in battle beyond karaoke before, he was thoroughly intimidated by the whole affair and simply fell to pieces. His own cowardice shamed him enormously, yet not quite enough to offer support to his friends whom he knew were engaged in a battle to death. He sat in the cold black tomb and wailed incessantly. Despite the tremendous valor and prowess displayed by Frank and his friends and the enormous damage they inflicted on the Negis of the field, the enemy kept coming in ever greater numbers and with ever mounting hostility. Frank began to see the futility of this battle and was unable to keep his heart from turning. The more he looked about, the more desperate their situation appeared and the more dispirited he became. He looked for his friends to see if there were some way they could regroup and escape. He needn't have bothered. At that moment, reinforcements came in their thousands. For his part, Negi Generation 1 was a formidable presence, showing the form against the Negis of the field that had so traumatized his friends earlier in the day. Clearly, the generations from the south were a larger and fiercer breed than their cousins to the north. Yet Negi Generation 1 had withdrawn from battle early on, and the posse assumed he had simply deserted them or been killed in action. On the contrary, he had departed to secure a greater force, and they arrived with a cry that left the Negis of the plains sounding like the air coming out of a balloon. Leading them, Negi Generation 1 came screaming in on the back of a Susquian, carrying an enormous clock as their standard. He left it by a clearing before leading his clan into the fray with a rousing battle cry. With the arrival of the generations, the battle took on epic proportions. While the Negis of the south were larger and fiercer, the Negis of the plain retained formidable numbers, and multitudes of them continued to rise and advance, surrounding the generations as they had Frank and his allies and inflicted heavy casualties on the generations. Negis of both clans were being set upon, sliced up, and butchered in most unholy manner. In scale and savagery, it was by the greatest battle in Negi history. One of the generations had the most enormous phallus, and with each swing of it, he could kill hundreds of Negis from the north. This monster was known amongst his own people as a hero, and his name was Negi Negris the Mandingo. He was worshipped by all the generations for generations to come. Even for Frank, who didn't have a merciful bone in his body, the scene was disturbing, and it troubled him to see the extent of the death and destruction unfolding all around him. He was still chromosome rich, and saw no alternative but to use his genetic muscle to bring an end to the atrocities. Though he lacked teaching and experience in the matter, his innate intuitions took over. He fought his way over to the large clock that Negi Generation 1 had carried into the battle, and when it was within reach, he grabbed it and held it above his head. With an almighty bellow, he yelled,
It's time to stop!
and thrust the clock hard into the soil at his feet. His words echoed out across the plains and the valleys, and power emanating through the clock altered the very fabric of time that they were in. A weird atmospheric distortion overwhelmed them, and every living creature in the land fell to the ground. For the rank and files, it was momentary, and they soon roused themselves, though weakened and achy. They observed all the devastation around them. The generations of the south, slightly more robust than their cousins to the north, survived the ordeal, but only just. It took days, even weeks for some, to recover, and even then, they were not quite as valiant or as resourceful as they had been before the incident. For the Negis of the South, chromosome weak and genetically deficient, the impact of the diffusion was permanent. As one, they fell silent, dropped to the ground, and ceased to breathe. The landscape was littered with them as far as the eye could see. The posse slowly regrouped, though there was little said between them for a long time. This had been a baptism for them, one in which they discovered new possibilities within themselves, new strengths, and most of all, a renewed camaraderie, one in which they now knew implicitly they had gained the full trust of each other. They were formidable until now. Although they remained physically weak at that time, they were spiritually strong, and they felt a delight in the bond they now shared. The exception to this, of course, was Safari Man. He remained in his cave unaware of anything that had expired in the course of the battle, and indeed unaware that combat had even ceased. The others had no idea what had happened to him after a cursory search, decided with sad reluctance to press on without him. The decision to do so didn't go unchallenged.
Yes.
We can't just leave him behind. It was Salamander Man.
What choice do we have?
Pink Guy pressed.
He's almost certainly dead, and in the event that he abandoned us in our hour of need, should he continue with us?
They muttered backwards and forwards in the matter for some time until Frank, who had wandered off a little, returned with an artifact in his hand. He held it out to his friends for them all to plainly see. He held Safari Man's glasses, shattered and twisted.
He is surely gone.
Frank said sullenly.
My brothers, he is gone. So should we be.
At this point, they had two great needs, time and coordinates. The clock maneuver had so exhausted Frank of his chromosome-weak world, there was no telling how long that would take. They also needed fresh coordinates, because none of them knew where to go from here. The primary dilemma for them was that Chin Chin would soon trace them to this place, and they would have neither the strength to face him, nor the chance to escape. They were in agreement that finding a quiet, secluded hamlet was their priority, and Negi Generation 1, who had now joined their troop, led them westward along the ridge of the hills toward the pink and orange clouds which hung over a region which he knew would meet their needs. Their spirits picked up as they made their way, and Salamander Man began to play a merry tune on his recorder. Pink Guy revealed some amusing secrets of the Omniverses, like the fact that mastoids, moral-tiered creatures with hideously huge noses, of the realm CX5P4200 reproduce asexually through laughter, and Frank told exaggerated stories of Okinawa and jokes of which the punchline inevitably involved Sergeant Benson's demise. The others, trundling along in single file, laughed along and enjoyed the cessation of hostilities, now known as the Great Negi War, in a way that only those who had known battle could. They made good progress, and by the end of the day were several landscapes away from their point of origin. None of them were aware of the change in the color of the clouds behind them, or the gentle swirling motion that turned the skies into a whirlpool. Above the battleground, now eerily silent and empty, the heavens darkened, and the wind whipped up into a chilly gale. Icy rain started to fall, and the beasts in those hills, which had survived the violence of the day, scattered with a newfound fear. Lightning cracked and the atmosphere parted, delivering a new entity to that environment. It was preceded by two minions, chained at the neck, thrashing and lashing at anything within reach. Gargoylean in appearance, they were wrapped in a wrinkled gray leathery skin like infants prematurely aged. Razor-sharp teeth protruded from their mouths, lacerating their own lips as they snarled and snapped, their drool a mix of saliva and their own blood. The prime entity, his feet on the ground immediately behind them, and looked around at the devastation of the landscape, the raised vegetation, the Negi corpses that littered the land, the clock still half buried in the ground, and was both intrigued and not a little concerned at the might which could have wrought this. Safari Man remained in his hideout, still wailing in anguish over his profound cowardice and loss of friendship. He sat in total darkness until the rock which he had leveraged up to the entrance of the cave suddenly moved. He looked up with unbridled fear and trepidation. The rock moved again, dislodging enough to allow light to pour into the cavern. A third time the rock moved, only this time it was flung with a mighty force to the very back of the chamber. Though he could see nothing of it yet, Safari Man was horrified at the power which had blown a boulder clear across the cavern, and he reeled back into one of the tiny recesses of that place. Then it came. At first it was almost pleasant, like that of thermal underground pools, but quickly turned acrid like the pungent rubbery smell of the subway escalators in New York. Then the odor became thoroughly toxic, burning his nostrils and lungs, and he began to choke and gag. A dark presence entered, ominous and fearsome, moving slowly but with unstoppable momentum, and turned to the little Japanese man. He looked down on him with eyes of detestation and contempt. Safari Man soiled himself again. It spoke with the voice of immortality. A stench filled the cavern as he said it. Safari Man was well versed in the language of the Dark Lord and heard it as though it were his own tongue. You are now mine, he said.
Chin Chin, I had nothing to do with what's been going on out there.
The Japanese man squeaked with a quivering voice. So you're a traitor and a coward.
Well,
Safari Man struggled for words.
A coward, yes. Traitor is a strong word, and I can't say that.
俺はお乳が大好きなんだよ
It wasn't a question, you pathetic little rodent. It was an identity that you will wear for the rest of your sad little existence. He sniffed about like a bear in heat.
おちんちんが大好きなんだよ
Where's Frank?
I don't know, I haven't seen him.
Instantly, Safari Man found himself down in mud at Chin Chin's feet.
俺はおちんちんが大好きなんだよ
Try again.
He was here, there was a battle, but I fled, I couldn't take it. I hid myself in this cave, and now they must have gone, but I swear I have no idea where.
おちんちんが大好きなんだよ
They left you behind.
Yeah.
He muttered, standing to his feet again.
俺はおちんちんが大好きなんだよ
They must despise you, I don't blame them. Who wouldn't? Safari Man retreated and slumped against the wall of the cave. It was over for him and he knew it. He was beyond fear now, and had nothing left to lose and no tears left to cry, so he spoke directly, almost disrespectfully, to the dark power before him.
Why do you want to kill Frank?
俺はおちんちんが大好きなんだよ
Kill Frank? I don't want to kill Frank, I want to harvest him. I want to rein him in. The air in the cave grew frosty and mean as he spoke.
俺はおちんちんが大好きなんだよ
He will come in handy in time, but he's useless to me right now. Safari Man, still loyal to Frank in his heart, spoke on.
How so? He's just another rank and file.
俺はおちんちんが大好きなんだよ
You want to play me? He was incensed.
俺はおちんちんが大好きなんだよ
You know he's chromosome rich and evolving all the time. That clock move was something. I've rarely come across such power. I felt it reverberate across the omniverses. He spoke in a way that approached awe.
俺はおちんちんが大好きなんだよ
But it wiped out most of his chromosomes. I need to give more time to replenish, but it will take forever in this realm. So, I will have to make a few adjustments to my agenda.
What is your agenda?
Once again, Safari Man found himself face down in the mud in front of Chin Chin, only this time the Dark Lord rested his foot heavily on Safari Man's head.
俺は
My agenda
おちんちんが大好きなんだよ
is none of your business. He let Safari Man breathe again.
俺はおちんちんが大好きなんだよ
Except to say that I will be taking you on a short pleasure cruise with me. He then laughed an awful screeching laugh that was eerily similar to the cries of the wretched in the dark sea.
俺はおちんちんが大好きなんだよ
Pleasure for me, that is. Negi Generation 1 led the posse onto a clearing of level ground at the foot of a small hill by a gently flowing freshwater stream. This part of the realm appeared uninhabited, so, though they were away from the thicker vegetation and somewhat exposed, they were at ease and began to prepare for the night. Without the aid of any clear leadership, each made their own contribution, and their efforts produced a surprisingly unified and very pleasant result. Negi Generation 1 returned from foraging in the hills with another Susquian and several Mitostrans, large avian-esque rodents about the size of a young capybara, to eat. With the aid of Drone, Pink Guy found a large number of edible plants and berries. Alpha Centurion prepared a roaring fire for the barbecue. Frank sat off at a distance and looked up into the sky. He could sense that something was off before he was able to observe the unnatural hues and behaviors of the clouds in the distance. He watched them turn and discolor and pondered them, sometimes fearfully, sometimes with an intrigue that bordered audacity. Salamander Man squatted on a rock only to caress his nipples for a moment before playing on. Pink Guy joined him later on his ukulele. It created a calming atmosphere at the end of a very traumatic day. They feasted and fooled about and farted until the sky grew completely dark, and the only light they could see by was the fire which Alpha Centurion continued to stoke, with nutty little giggles, well beyond what was needed. It was Pink Guy who first felt the chill, which initially mistook for a natural drop in temperature. Frank caught it shortly after the two of them locked eyes. They turned toward the hill to vaguely make out an enormous dark creature quietly descending from the vegetation. As it drew nearer the fire, they could make out its form and tier. Alpha Centurion had no such knowledge. When he saw it, he jumped a mile in the air. "What the fuck is that?" he shrieked. Before them stood one of the ugliest creatures to roam the omniverses, a hideous-looking bug with umpteen long, spindly legs on each side of its torso. It was essentially a Gagey the size of a bus, yet with a mortal face. How do you squash a bug that size? Centurion asked.
You can't.
Pink Guy responded.
It's not a beast, it's a chimpilla, and his name is Gitson.
He approached his superior defiantly.
What do you want here?
It struck Pink Guy hard, knocking him head over heels into the stream.
Put a leash on your friends,
It said to Frank in a waspish voice.
unless you want to see them permanently ruined.
The others all immediately fell in line behind Frank.
As much as I'd love to stay and play with you all,
It said, sneering.
I'm only here on business.
It spoke with a wicked raspiness, and its face scrunched up as it spoke, as though forming words required tremendous and painful effort.
Stand over there.
It said to Frank, smacking him off his feet to a spot on the other side of the fire.
Thank you.
It turned and faced the remaining members of the Brotherhood.
The Dark Lord has decided that he would prefer to have you in other realms.
What other realms? Salamander Man asked in deep distress.
Oh, she speaks.
Gitson said.
Then you will go first.
It reached up and over with one of its long gangly legs, picked Salamander Man, and dropped him into the center of the fire, which was still roaring with activity.
No!
Alpha Centurion called. Suddenly the mischievousness of making such a conflagration overcame him, and he buried his face in his hands, guilt-ridden to the core, and howled. The horror of this sound was only surpassed by that of Salamander Man, who screamed an agonizing yes. For a few short moments before disappearing altogether when Gitson spoke into the fire a language that was unintelligible to any of them. Immediately, Drone took flight and raced away, but he was no match for the speed and dexterity of the Chimpia, who grabbed him in another skeletal leg and flung him hard into the heart of the fire. It uttered once again into the flame, and Drone was gone. This left Alpha Centurion and Negi Generation 1.
Ian,
It grumbled to Negi.
piss off.
Negi was caught completely off guard by these words.
You don't know what piss off means? Perhaps you'd rather be with your friends in the fire. We don't need you, you're dead weight. Piss off to whatever sorry little hole in the ground you came from and never come back here again.
Negi Generation 1 looked at Frank and with welling eyes wished him all the best. He then took flight with his little white legs spinning as fast as they could go, and his brown Negi hair sprouts flailing about, and disappeared into the darkness. The Chimpia wrapped itself around Alpha Centurion and began to prod him with its knuckly feet and feel him out with its antennas.
You're cute.
It whispered in deep, amorous tones. It salivated as it said it. Centurion was a ball of screaming terror, taboo words, and thrash, and this only served to excite the Chimpia even more. It put an antenna deep into Centurion's throat before placing it in its own.
I'll bet you taste good all over.
Alpha Centurion, rediscovering the fight on himself, began to bite at the joints of Gitson's legs in between the screams. This had little effect other than to further endear himself to the Chimpia.
I thought you were here for business.
Frank spoke with the same tone of defiance that Pink Guy had. The creature looked over at Frank with revulsion. It picked up Alpha Centurion and tossed him into the center of the flames without so much as even looking in that direction. With a brief shrill from the runt and another burst of unintelligible words from Gitson, Alpha Centurion was gone.
You want to do business? Let's do business.
It began to slither towards Frank as it spoke. Its words now came with spittle and hiss.
Just know that if it were up to me, I'd have sliced you into pieces and had you for dinner before the eggs were ready.
Well, it's a good thing we don't have eggs.
It pressed its ornery face up to Frank's.
I hate you so much.
The words seeped out.
I want to damn you. I want to make you one of the wretched.
Remind me to never let this guy near a public high school.
Frank said to himself. It looked ready to strike Frank again.
But I'm only here with a message. I'm confined to the message. Tomorrow, you will be given coordinates. Go where they take you and don't ask questions. It is a high chromosome realm. There you will replenish and the Dark Lord will harvest your chromosomes in his good time. With that, I must leave.
Frank dropped and sat up against a flat-topped rock. He was shaking. There was no longer any sound other than the cackle of the fire, and no light save that coming from the flames. Beyond him, out there was no longer anything. Sight, sound, presence all ceased to exist. He was alone, and it petrified him. He took his mind back to the start of the day, whatever period of time that was, when Safari Man woke him up in New York. Back then, he had a warm bed, friends and respite from the madness of the omniverses. Now he had nothing but fear and an antipathy to life. He lay down but was far too worked up to sleep, and the night seemed to drag for eons. At some point he drifted off, But unease was never far from him. He was woken in the dim light of an overcast morning by the sound of an almighty thud. The impact it made shook the ground, and Frank sat up startled and looked about him. There were no further movements or sounds. The fire desisted to a large heap of embers. A very gentle breeze blew over the wispy shoots coming from the ground, and the stream they had camped by produced a very lazy flow that meandered around the rocks. Frank continued to look about him. He surveyed the vegetation on the hilltop, the empty plains that stretched out in the opposite direction, and the tedious gray of the sky. Nothing. He roused himself and made his way to the still waters. There he washed his face, his arms and hands, and drank freely. He waded downstream a little before making his way back to the campsite. The scenery was less familiar to him in the morning light. The terrain appeared sandier and less stepped than it had in the twilight hours. A large pale branch up ahead had gone completely unnoticed in the evening preparations. The flora was more sparse and less lush than he had remembered. Suddenly he thought it prudent to gather firewood to keep the fire alive, as it's much easier to kindle a fire than start one. As he was about to step around the pale bough, it struck him with alarm that it wasn't a branch fallen from a nearby tree. It was Negi Generation 1. His body had been mutilated and he lay lifeless on the ground. It was clear to Frank, from the sound that woke him up and the damage to the corpse, that he had been dropped or thrown from a very great height. Most disturbing of all were the lacerations all over his body. He studied them fastidiously. The coordinates of Frank's next realm had been carved into Negi Generation 1's flesh. He fell back horrified, making primal sounds from the back of his throat. Just when he thought he could no longer be scared, a new horror would befall him and would learn the meaning of fear all over again. It took him a while to regain his composure. He had a dreaded sense by following these coordinates he was simply moving from one nightmare to another, more treacherous one. But what choice did he have? He took a moment to consider his options, but there was simply no choice that worked. Inevitably, he succumbed. He grabbed a small, sharp stick from the bank of the stream and, driven by anger, thrust it into his forearm far deeper than he needed to for the task. Blood shot out, and Frank began to create the crimson circle that was beginning to define his life on the ground around him. In an utterly morbid and detached voice, he repeated the coordinates that had been cut into Negi's body. The response was rapid. He fell into a trance, collapsed onto the ground, and began convulsing. His field of vision narrowed, and all he could recall seeing were the tendrils of a small tree growing over the steam, reaching out to him. They touched his face, gently and affectionately at first, but gradually more menacingly and forcefully, till its clutches were tugging at his features and pulling at his hair. As though anesthetized, Frank could say or do nothing in response. He was screaming inside, but his body seemed incapable of responding. The entity wrapped more and more entrails around his face, ripping at his flesh and gauging at his eyes. At the moment of his ultimate suffering, Frank found his voice.
I'm sorry, I couldn't help it.